Smallville co-stars Allison Mack and Michael Rosenbaum had a mini reunion last week when Allison Mack went on Michael's podcast to talk about being in a cult and eventually going to prison for committing crimes while she was in the cult. In case you didn't know, Allison and Michael were both in Smallville. Michael Rosenbaum played Lex Luthor, and now he has a podcast called NXIVM. And he asked Allison if she would be willing to come on and talk a little bit about herself and her experience. CBC Podcast actually just released a podcast series about Allison Mack and her story. They interviewed her for the podcast. It is being released one at a time, once a week. Unless you subscribe, you can get it all now. But it is the first time that Allison is publicly speaking about her time in NXIVM and her experience eventually being sentenced to prison time. And I will admit, I was extremely skeptical of it at first, but after listening to the first 3 episodes and listening to this podcast, I do think that everyone deserves a chance to share their story and share their perspective. I am glad that Allison herself is not profiting off of this, and she is not going back into a field of work that requires this level of fame or attention or promotion. That doesn't seem to be why she's doing it, and it doesn't seem like she's getting paid for any of these appearances, which I very much think is essential. I definitely have very mixed feelings listening to her talk about her story because she was both a victim and a perpetrator, but she seems to understand that very well, so I appreciate that. And obviously this is a very complicated and nuanced topic, not something that I have any answers for or even claim to know what the right way and wrong way to go about something like this is. But I do think from a psychological perspective and from the perspective of understanding cults and people's mindset when they are in a cult, it is very fascinating to hear her story. And I do hope that it could help some people who maybe have been in a similar position or help prevent people from being in that position in the future. But I found this particular podcast especially fascinating because Allison talks a little bit more casually and candidly and talks about how she thinks being in the TV and film industry from such a young age had a huge negative impact on her and her life and her self-esteem, more so even than her home life. And if you have followed me, you might know that I am very fascinated in how being a child star is very similar to being raised in a cult. So it was super fascinating to hear her talk about that a little bit. I was also pretty impressed that Michael seemed to ask some pretty hard questions as well, some of which Allison didn't even really have the answer to, which I think is fine, but he wasn't just fawning over her and saying, look at my good friend Allison, who's such a nice person. He seemed genuinely curious about what she went through. If you've seen this interview, let me know. If you've seen the other podcast, let me know what you think.